The rhythmic ring of iron chisels striking limestone echoes across the massive retaining walls of the Temple Mount. For Eliazar, a master mason of 45 years, the sound has been the heartbeat of his life for a decade. His skin is leathered by the Judean sun, and his calloused hands are permanently stained white with the fine dust of the quarry. He stands at the southwestern, a house fit for the God of Israel. Yet, as Eleazar's gaze shifts upward, he sees the dark square towers of the Antonia fortress looming over the sacred courts. The Roman soldiers stationed there are a constant reminder of the world outside these walls. Eleazar works to glorify the Almighty, but he does so under the command of King Herod, a man whose architectural genius is matched only by his cruelty. In the market and the quarry, men speak in whispers, for the king's informants are everywhere, and Eleazar knows all too well that the hand that commissioned this sanctuary is the same hand that has not hesitated to spill the blood of his own kin. This tension, the juxtaposition of sacred beauty and military force, is the defining characteristic of Herod's Jerusalem. To a man like Eleazar, who spends his days shaping the very bones of the city, the king is a paradox that cannot be ignored. Herod rebuilt the Second Temple on a scale that surpassed even Solomon's original vision, ostensibly to win the hearts of a people who viewed him as an outsider. Yet as Eleazar moves to the lower markets after his shift, he sees the enforcers, the network of spies, that Josephus, our primary external historian, tells us Herod used to keep the populace in a state of constant low-level dread. In this journey, we will explore Herod's reign through the lens of Eleazar's world, examining the archaeological remains of the fortresses that still scar the landscape, the detailed chronicles of Flavius Josephus, and the sobering accounts found within the Gospels. We are forced to confront a central, haunting question. How could one man be both the greatest builder in Judean history and its most feared tyrant? To find the answer, we must look at the foundations of his power. Foundations laid not just in the limestone Eleazar carves, but in Roman iron and the weight of a stolen crown. Eleazar rests his hand on the sharp, drafted edge of a massive block, his fingers tracing the precision of the groove. He knows the lineage of these stones better than the lineage of the man who ordered them placed here. In the quiet corners of the lower city, the elders still speak of the year 37 before our era, the year the Roman siege engines battered the walls of Jerusalem to place Herod on the throne. Eleazar was only a child then, but the stories of the blood in the streets and the smoke over the temple stay with a man. Herod was not a son of David. He was an Idumean, a man from the south whose family's conversion to Judaism was viewed by many in Jerusalem as a matter of political convenience rather than ancestral faith. To the observant, he was an half-Jew, an interloper who had bypassed the ancient laws of succession through the favor of foreign gods and generals. The historian Josephus provides us with the cold political reality behind Eleazar's unease. He records how Herod traveled across the sea to Rome, appearing before the Senate to be officially declared King of the Jews. It was a title granted by Roman decree, not by divine anointing or the voice of the people. To the Roman powers, Herod was the ideal client king, a loyal, efficient administrator who could hold the volatile eastern frontier of the empire against the Parthians. But to men like Eleazar, this king was an outsider who held a stolen crown. This is the great tension of the Herodian era, a ruler who sought to buy the legitimacy he lacked through the sheer scale of his monuments. Every stone Eleazar cuts is an attempt by Herod to prove he belongs, a desperate bid to overshadow the Hasmonean kings who came before him and to silence the whispers that he is merely a puppet supported by Roman iron. Eleazar knows that while the king builds for the God of Israel, his eyes are always turned toward the power of the West. The ambition of the king did not stop at the gates of Jerusalem. Eleazar often hears the talk of the stonecutters who have returned from the coast, their lungs filled with the salt of the great sea rather than the dry dust of the Judean hills. They tell stories of a city called Caesarea Maritima, where Herod has done the impossible. He has conquered the ocean itself. Archaeologists today walk the submerged ruins of what was once the most sophisticated deepwater harbor in the ancient world. To a man of the craft like Eliazar, the technical details are almost beyond belief. Herod's engineers used pozzolana, a volcanic ash imported from Italy that allowed concrete to set underwater, a Roman secret adapted to the Judean shore. It is a mastery over nature that speaks of a king who refuses to be limited by the land he was given. Yet as Eliazar wipes the sweat from his brow with a dust-caked hand, he understands that this monumental beauty is shadowed by a profound, restless fear. While the king builds harbors to welcome the world, he also builds fortresses to hide from it. We look to the Judean wilderness, to the heights of Masada and the artificial mountain of Herodium, and we see the architecture of paranoia. These were not merely palaces of luxury, they were escape hatches, fortified with massive cisterns and storehouses, designed to protect a man who trusted no one. Herod built for glory, creating landmarks that would endure for millennia. But he lived for survival, always looking over his shoulder toward the desert horizon. For Eliazar, the stones are heavy with this duality. The king's genius for creation is inseparable from the terror that drives him to build ever higher walls. This is the weight Eliazar feels as he returns to his work on the temple platform. He is building a house for the Almighty, but he is doing so for a patron who fears his own shadow. I stand today before a meticulous model of the Herodian temple, and even at this scale, the ambition is staggering. For Eliazar, this was not a model, but a reality of towering white marble and gleaming gold that dominated the Jerusalem skyline. We see him now, kneeling at the base of a massive Corinthian column, his calloused fingers working a fine, abrasive stone to polish the base until it reflects the harsh Judean sun. He knows that his labor contributes to what many in the ancient world considered the most magnificent structure in the East, a feat of engineering that rivaled the wonders of Rome and Alexandria. To Eleazar, every finished surface is an act of devotion, yet he cannot ignore that the very stones he polishes are held together by the will of a man whose soul is fracturing. If you want to go beyond this episode and see the wider historical world around the Bible, I gathered these studies in my book. There I go deeper into maps, empires, chronology, sources, and disputed questions that cannot fit fully into one video. The link to the book is in the description. Now let us return to the person at the center of this story and to the world he had to live through. As the sun begins to dip behind the Judean hills, casting long shadows across the temple courts, Eleazar gathers his tools and makes his way through the upper city toward the market. The air here is different from the high, clean winds of the temple platform. It is thick with the smell of roasting meat, spices, and the low, hurried whispers of anxious men. At a stall selling oil and grain, he catches fragments of a conversation that makes him tighten his grip on his leather tool belt. The rumors that have been simmering for weeks are boiling over. The king is ill. It is said that a strange, consuming fire is eating him from within, and as his body fails, his legendary temper has turned into a lethal, unpredictable madness. Eleazar moves quickly, his eyes downcast, for he knows that in Jerusalem, a sick king is often more dangerous than a healthy one. The beauty of the white stone above him seems suddenly fragile, a grand mask hiding the rot of a dying regime. Eleazar adjusts the strap of his tool bag as he nears the western wall of the city, where Herod's palace rises like a mountain of dressed stone. The three great towers, Phasael, Hippicus, and Mariamne, loom over the streets, monuments to the king's power and his grief. As a mason, Eleazar admires the precision of the joints, but as a father and a man of Judea, he feels a chill in the shadow of these walls. He knows that the tower named for Mariamne is a monument to the wife Herod loved with a consuming passion and then executed in a fit of paranoid rage. This was the dark reality of the man who sat on the throne. The same hand that designed the glory of the temple was stained with the blood of his own household. The historical records from this period describe a court that had become a slaughterhouse. Flavius Josephus details how Herod's suspicion eventually turned against his own flesh and blood, leading him to execute 3 of his sons, Alexander, Aristobulus, and finally Antipater, on charges of treason. The internal rot of the Herodian dynasty was so well known across the Roman world that the author Macrobius later recorded a grim joke attributed to Emperor Augustus himself, that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son. In the Greek language of the court, the words for pig and son sounded nearly identical, but the reality behind the pun was anything but humorous. To the Romans, Herod was a useful, if unstable, client. To his family, he was a predator. Eliazar walks faster now, his sandals slapping against the stone pavement as he passes the heavy ironclad gates of the palace. He sees the Thracian and German mercenaries standing guard, their shields catching the last rays of light. They are outsiders, loyal only to the king's coin, and their presence is a constant reminder that Herod does not trust his own people. The city around Eliazar is undeniably beautiful, a triumph of urban planning and wealth, but the air is thick with a heavy, unnatural silence. Men do not speak the king's name aloud in the markets, and they do not linger in the squares to discuss the news. In a city where the walls have ears and the king's mind is unraveling, survival depends on being invisible. Eliazar reaches the door of his modest home, grateful for the anonymity of the shadows, unaware that the king's paranoia is about to collide with a prophecy that will shake the foundations of the very world he is building. The air in Jerusalem, already heavy with the king's suspicion, suddenly sharpens with a new, terrifying rumor that filters down from the upper city to the markets where Eleazar buys his daily grain. He hears of a caravan, men of status from the east, perhaps from Parthia, who have entered the city gates not with tribute for Herod, but with a question that feels like a death sentence to anyone within earshot. They are asking for the one-born king of the Jews, for a man like Eleazar, who has spent his life carving the symbols of Herod's legitimacy into stone. The phrasing is an earthquake. He knows the king's mind. He has seen the towers named for the dead and the fortresses built out of fear. To Herod, there is no born king. There is only the king who took the throne by Roman iron and holds it by Idumean will. The Gospel of Matthew records that when Herod heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. This detail rings with historical authenticity. The city's anxiety was not for the Magi, but for what the king would do in response to a perceived rival. We see in the biblical text a psychological profile that fits perfectly with the secular history written by Josephus. A man who would not spare his own sons would certainly not hesitate to strike at a village of peasants. The account of the massacre of the innocents in Bethlehem is often a point of scholarly debate, primarily because it is absent from the writings of Josephus, who was usually meticulous in recording Herod's atrocities. However, as a historian, I find the silence of external sources less a contradiction and more a matter of scale. In the final months of Herod's life, his court was a whirlwind of executions and political purges. Bethlehem at the time was a small, unremarkable village. The number of male children under the age of 2 would have been relatively few, perhaps a dozen or two. To a historian like Josephus, focused on the grand tragedies of the palace and the fate of the nation, a small-scale slaughter in a Judean hamlet would have been a minor footnote, an unremarkable cruelty in a reign already drowning in the blood of high priests and princes. For Eleazar, watching the heavy patrols move toward the southern road, the king's reaction is not a surprise. It is the logical conclusion of a life built on the sand of insecurity. The king of the Jews in the palace was now pitted against a king of kings in a manger, and the master mason can feel the city holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable crack in the foundation. The whispers in the market soon turned into a grim certainty. The king was rotting while he still drew breath. Eliazar and his fellow masons heard the reports filtered through palace servants of a sickness so foul it seemed to defy nature. Flavius Josephus provides a chillingly detailed account of Herod's final agony, describing a burning fever, an intolerable itching of the whole body, and a gangrene that produced worms. To the people of Judea, this was not merely a medical failure, it was seen as divine judgment for a life of unparalleled cruelty. As a historian, I look to the events surrounding this gruesome end to anchor our timeline. Josephus records that shortly before Herod died, there was an eclipse of the moon, a detail that allows us to sync ancient records with modern astronomy. This points to the spring of 4 BC, providing the historical boundary for the Nativity. The child whom the Magi sought had to have been born while this dying tyrant still held his grip on the throne, his paranoia fueled by the knowledge that his own body was failing him. Herod's final journey was not to the temple he rebuilt, but to Herodium, the massive palace fortress that looms like a man-made volcano over the Judean wilderness. In 2007, after 35 years of searching, archaeologist Ehud Netzer finally discovered the remains of Herod's royal tomb on the slope of that mountain. The evidence found there was striking. The royal sarcophagus, carved from fine reddish limestone, had been smashed into hundreds of fragments. This was not the result of a ceiling collapse or the slow decay of centuries, but of intentional, violent destruction. It is a powerful archaeological inference that once the king was dead and his terror had lifted, the people, perhaps even men like Eliazar, who had been forced to build these monuments, took their hammers to the stone. They could not undo his reign, but they could shatter the memory of the man who had turned their holy city into a gilded cage. For Eliazar, the death of the king was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new, uncertain era for the stones he had laid. The air in Jerusalem is different now. Eliazar stands on the broad southern steps, the very stones he helped shape and set. Beneath his feet, the limestone is smooth, a testament to a decade of his life spent in the service of a king he never loved. Each block bears the signature of the era, the distinct drafted margins, that precise, recessed border that defines Herodian architecture. It was a style meant to project order, power, and an eternal presence. But the man who commanded this precision is in his grave. The kingdom is no longer a single terrifying entity. It is being carved up among Herod's surviving sons. Archelaus now holds Judea, Antipas rules Galilee, and Philip governs the territories to the north. The peace Herod enforced through fear is fracturing, replaced by a growing, restless energy in the crowds that gather for the festivals. As Eleazar wipes the white dust from his calloused palms and looks up at the towering facade of the royal stoa, he likely felt a sense of permanence. These stones were too massive to move, too heavy to fail. They were the pride of the nation. Yet as a historian looking back through the lens of archaeology and the gospel accounts, I see the tragic irony in his labor. We know what Eleazar could not, that within 70 years, the very beauty he worked to create would be systematically dismantled. The Roman legions, driven by the very unrest beginning to stir in Eleazar's day, would cast these stones into the valley below until not one was left upon another. The legacy of the master builder was destined to become a monument of ruins, a stark reminder that no amount of stone and gold can provide the security the human heart truly craves. Eleazar unbuckles his leather tool belt for the last time, the iron buckle clicking in the evening silence. He looks down at his hands, where the limestone dust has settled deep into the cracks of his calloused skin, a map of a decade spent in the service of a king's ambition. He is a witness to a paradox that history is never quite resolved. He has spent his life crafting a house for God under the command of a man who lived as if he were his own God. Herod built this temple of stone to mask a profound, trembling insecurity, hoping that the sheer scale of his monuments would buy the legitimacy and the peace that his own soul lacked. But as Eliazar walks away from the Temple Mount, leaving behind the white marble and the shimmering gold, he represents the thousands of common people who saw the blood behind the beauty. The spiritual meaning of this era is found in the clash of two very different kings. Herod sought security in the massive blocks of the Master Course, believing that stone and mortar could preserve his name forever. Yet the biblical text and the historical record suggest that while Herod was fortifying his palace, a different kind of temple was entering the world, a living temple that did not require the labor of slaves or the gold of an empire. Christ came not to build walls of exclusion, but to offer a sanctuary for the broken and the humble, providing the very security Herod could never find, despite all his fortresses. The greatness of the building could not save the man, and the stones Eliazar laid with such care would eventually become a testament to the vanity of earthly power. The true temple would be found elsewhere, in a kingdom not made with hands. If you want to continue this journey more deeply, my book is available through the link in the description. In the next episode, we will move to another moment where faith, imperial power, and historical evidence meet in a particularly sharp way.